The blue lights hit your rearview mirror before your brain fully processes what's happening. 1 second you're just driving home, maybe thinking about dinner, maybe replaying your day, and the next second your chest tightens just a little. You check your speed. Was I speeding? Did I miss a sign? Your hands instinctively move to the wheel, and suddenly every small movement feels like it matters. The officer steps out of the cruiser slowly. Not rushed, not aggressive, just controlled. Watching. Always watching. Have you ever been pulled over and felt like the situation got tense for no clear reason, like something small suddenly turned serious? Tell me what happened in the comments, because later on I'm going to explain one specific change in 2026 that's quietly making those moments even more complicated, and most drivers don't even realize it's happening. Now here's the thing most people don't understand. Traffic laws don't just change in obvious ways like new speed limits or new fines. The real changes, the ones that actually affect how your traffic stop unfolds, often happen in procedure, interpretation, and enforcement priorities. And in 2026, there have been several shifts that are subtle on paper, but powerful on the road. I'm not talking about theory. I'm talking about what actually happens when you're sitting in that driver's seat, window cracked, heart beating just a little faster, while an officer is deciding how this interaction is going to go. One of the biggest changes this year revolves around what officers are now allowed to consider as reasonable suspicion during a stop. That phrase gets thrown around a lot, but in real life, it's less about a clear rule and more about a collection of small observations. And in 2026, that collection has expanded in ways that can catch drivers off guard. Let me paint a picture. You're pulled over for something minor, maybe a rolling stop. The officer approaches and starts asking questions that feel unrelated. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? You hesitate not because you're guilty of anything, but because you're thinking. And that hesitation, combined with something as simple as avoiding eye contact or fumbling with your documents, can now be used more easily to extend the stop. That's new in how it's being enforced. Not necessarily new in law, but new in how confidently it's being applied. And here's where drivers make their first mistake. They think being overly cooperative will make everything go faster. So they start talking, explaining, filling silence. But from the officer's perspective, silence is information, and so is talking too much. They're not just listening to your words, they're measuring timing, tone, consistency. They're watching your hands, your breathing, your eye movement. In 2026, training has emphasized behavioral analysis even more. Officers are being taught to read people, not just situations. That means your behavior during the first 30 seconds matters more than ever. Now let's talk about something that changed quietly but is becoming a serious issue. Document handling during traffic stops. You hand over your license, registration, and insurance. Standard procedure. But in 2026, there's been increased scrutiny, and in some places, extended authority around how long officers can retain those documents while running checks. What does that mean in real life? It means you might be sitting there longer than you expect, wondering what's taking so long, while the officer is not just verifying your information, but also running additional checks that weren't as common before. And here's the part that people don't realize. While your documents are in their possession, you're not free to leave, even if the original reason for the stop seems resolved. That extended holding time creates pressure. You start wondering if something's wrong. You might be tempted to ask questions, or worse, step out of the vehicle without being asked. Both of those can shift the tone of the stop very quickly. There's another change in 2026 that's causing a lot of confusion, especially among drivers who think they understand their rights. Passenger questioning. It used to be more straightforward. The driver is the focus. Passengers are secondary unless there's a clear reason. But now, officers are increasingly encouraged to engage passengers early in the stop. Why? Because inconsistent stories between driver and passenger can create reasonable suspicion. Imagine this. The officer asks you where you're going. You say, "Home." Then they casually lean toward the passenger and ask, "Where are you guys headed tonight?" The passenger says, "Just grabbing food." Now you've got a discrepancy. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything, depending on how the officer interprets it. This is where people get tripped up. They assume passengers don't need to be prepared for interaction. But in 2026, passengers are very much part of the equation, and this leads us directly into the rule most drivers are missing, the one I hinted at earlier. In 2026, there's been a significant shift in how refusal to answer questions is interpreted during a stop. Legally, you still have the right to remain silent beyond providing required identification. That hasn't changed. But the way silence is perceived has evolved. Officers are now more likely to treat selective silence, answering some questions but not others, as a behavioral indicator worth noting. It doesn't mean you're guilty. It doesn't automatically escalate the situation, but it can influence the officer's decision-making process. Here's how it plays out. You answer basic questions at first. Then the officer asks something more specific, maybe about your day or your destination, and you decide to stop answering. From your perspective, you're exercising your rights. From the officer's perspective, there's a change in behavior. That change becomes part of the narrative. This is the mistake most drivers make, not understanding that consistency matters just as much as content. If you're going to limit what you say, it has to be done calmly, respectfully, and consistently from the beginning, not halfway through the conversation when it suddenly feels uncomfortable. Otherwise, it creates a contrast, and contrast is exactly what officers are trained to notice. Another major change this year involves vehicle exit orders. Officers have always had the authority to ask drivers to step out of the vehicle during a lawful stop, but in 2026, the threshold for when that request is made has lowered in practice. You might be asked to step out not because you did anything wrong, but because the officer wants a better view, more control, or simply a different angle of interaction. And here's where things get tense. The moment you step out of your vehicle, the dynamic changes completely. You're more exposed. The officer has more control over positioning. Your body language becomes even more visible. A lot of drivers unintentionally make things worse at this stage. They turn too quickly. They ask, "Why do I have to get out?" in a tone that sounds defensive. They hesitate just long enough to create uncertainty. What officers are looking for in that moment is compliance without resistance, not fear, not submission, just calm, controlled movement. There's also been an increase in what I'd call layered questioning. Instead of asking one question at a time, officers might repeat the same question in slightly different ways. Where are you coming from? What were you doing there? How long were you there? It sounds simple, but it's designed to test consistency. And in 2026, this technique is being used more deliberately. Drivers often get frustrated. I already answered that. And that frustration shows. Tone shifts, body language tightens. From the officer's perspective, that reaction can be just as important as the answer itself. Let's talk about something that feels small but can escalate quickly: reaching movements. In 2026, there's been increased emphasis on officer safety training, particularly around sudden movements inside the vehicle. That means even something as harmless as reaching into your glove compartment without warning can raise concern. You might think, "I'm just getting my registration." But the officer doesn't know that yet. The safest move now is to narrate your actions. "My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it." It sounds simple, but it removes uncertainty, and uncertainty is what escalates situations. Another change that's catching drivers off guard is the use of silence by officers themselves. Yes, silence. Officers are being trained to use pauses strategically. They might ask a question and then just wait. No follow-up, no pressure, just silence. And here's what happens. Most people feel uncomfortable with silence, so they start talking, adding details, over-explaining. That's not accidental, it's a technique. You might start with, "I'm heading home," and then add, "I was at a friend's place just watching a game, nothing crazy." Now you've introduced more variables, more details that can be explored. Sometimes less really is more. But knowing when to speak and when to stop is a skill most drivers haven't developed. There's also been a noticeable shift in how minor infractions are being used as entry points for broader investigation. A broken tail light, a slight lane drift, a delayed signal. These are still minor on their own, but in 2026, they're increasingly being treated as opportunities to observe driver behavior in a controlled setting. It's not about the violation anymore. It's about what happens after the stop begins. And that's where most drivers lose control of the situation, not legally but behaviorally. They let nerves dictate their tone. They rush their movements. They answer questions without thinking. They challenge authority at the wrong moment, or they comply in ways that create more suspicion. There's a balance, and it's not always intuitive. One last thing that's changed this year, and it's subtle but important: the increased use of body cameras and how that affects both sides of the interaction. Everything is being recorded, not just what you say, but how you say it. Not just what the officer does, but how they interpret your behavior in real time. That recording becomes the official version of events. So when you're sitting there, hands on the wheel, trying to decide how to respond to a question, understand this. The interaction isn't just happening in the moment. It's being documented, reviewed, and potentially used later in ways you might not expect. And that's why these changes matter. Because the traffic stop isn't just about the reason you were pulled over anymore. It's about how the entire interaction unfolds, second by second, word by word, movement by movement. Most drivers think they'll figure it out if it happens, that they'll just be normal and everything will be fine. But normal, under pressure, isn't always predictable. And in 2026, predictability is exactly what officers are trained to look for, and what unpredictable behavior, even innocent behavior, can complicate faster than you think. So the next time those blue lights appear behind you and your instincts start kicking in, remember this. It's not just about what you did before the stop. It's about everything that happens after.